So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed looking at the treasures in the library. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Anne Somerset. She and I were both talking at Cliveden Literary Festival this weekend, which was a very glamorous affair. This is a very modest offering, but equally stimulating, I hope. So Anne Somerset's most recent book, which I've read, is absolutely brilliant. I really recommend it. It's on Queen Victoria and her Prime Ministers, a personal history, and it was published in 2024. Her 6 other books include An Acclaimed Life of Elizabeth and Queen Anne, The Politics of Passion, which won the 2013 Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography.
Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I'm talking about Queen Victoria and the 14th Earl of Derby. I'm afraid it might cover some of the ground covered so brilliantly earlier by Jeff Hicks, so I hope you don't find it too repetitive, but anyway. When the 14th Earl of Derby became Prime Minister for what turned out to be the first of 3 times in February 1852, Queen Victoria was frankly appalled. 6 years earlier, Derby, or Lord Stanley as he was then, not having yet inherited the earldom, had resigned from the cabinet of the Conservative leader Sir Robert Peel after the latter had become a convert to the policy of Corn Law repeal. Peel had succeeded in repealing the Corn Laws before his government had been brought down on another question, but Stanley had led the opposition to repeal in the House of Lords. When the Conservative Party split after losing office in June 1846, Stanley became leader of the protectionist wing that remained committed to reintroducing the Corn Laws. Since Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, were convinced that this would be catastrophic, they were profoundly distrustful of him. In early 1851, it had briefly appeared that Stanley might head a government after Lord John Russell's Whig ministry ran into difficulties, and the Queen and Prince Albert did not hide that they found the idea alarming. When Stanley arrived at the palace to discuss arrangements, he could see plainly Victoria had been in tears, while Albert was openly hostile. Having established that Stanley would like to reintroduce a moderate duty on corn, the prince not only expressed displeasure, but said he feared the monarchy would suffer by being associated with an unpopular government. Even Victoria was somewhat embarrassed by her husband's offensive stance and tried to smooth over the awkwardness. But she remained far from happy at the prospect of Stanley being Prime Minister, not least because it was clear that his deputy, Benjamin Disraeli, who had vitriolically attacked Peel during Corn Law repeal debates and whom the Queen considered obnoxious, would be given a prominent position in the ministry. So she was distinctly relieved when on 27th February 1851, Stanley had told her he had found it impossible to put forward together a viable ministerial team. But only a year later, the 14th Earl of Derby, as Lord Stanley had become following the death of his father the previous July, once again looked set to become Prime Minister after Lord John Russell's government finally imploded. The Queen dreaded what would happen in consequence. She confided to an advisor that she felt the danger of a trial of a protectionist government cannot be sufficiently overrated, fearing that once the Corn Laws were reimposed, I feel convinced that there will be commotions. Yet though she would have preferred to look elsewhere for a Prime Minister, at the time she could not think of another politician who would be capable of forming an administration, and so reluctantly accepted there was no alternative to Derby. Her acquaintance with Lord Derby had hitherto been limited, and what little she had heard about him had tended to prejudice her against him. In fact, Derby was a more impressive figure than might have been assumed from the image he projected of a bluff countryman. A political opponent acknowledged he possessed a marvellous acuteness of intellect and consummate power in debate. There is no subject which he cannot thoroughly master and lucidly explain. Immensely rich from inherited wealth, Derby was a devotee of rural pursuits and horse racing, and much preferred discussing those subjects to talking of politics. The diarist, Charles Greville, recorded that those who had been impressed by his statesman-like performances in the Lords would have been astonished to see him at the racecourse at Newmarket, in the midst of a crowd of blacklegs, betters, and loose characters of every description, in their uproarious spirits, chaffing, rowing, and shouting with laughter and joking. When in this mode, Derby was hardly the kind of man likely to endear himself to Queen Victoria. The Whig Duke of Argyll thought Derby too rollicking, too apt to treat everything as a joke, and Derby could be insensitive in the way he teased other people. Both Sir Robert Peel and Mrs. Disraeli became visibly uncomfortable when they stayed at Knowsley, and he made them the butt of jokes. His loud humour would also sometimes make the Queen uneasy. After he visited Osborne in August 1852, she wrote in her journal, "He turns everything too much into ridicule, which I do not quite like." A few months later, she was more appreciative, as she described Lord Derby in great force, making us all laugh at the many funny stories he told. All the same, I suspect that Prince Albert remained unappreciative of his humour. Politically, Derby was both a shrewd operator and a man of strong core beliefs. While profoundly disagreeing with Derby on the Corn Law question, Victorian Albert recognised that his opposition to repeal had been principled, which they did not feel to have been the case with Disraeli. When Peel had first told his cabinet what he was contemplating, Derby had objected, "We cannot do this as gentlemen." He resigned despite being deeply upset about splitting the Conservative Party and always hoped for its reunification. Yet, notwithstanding his integrity, he understood the need for pragmatism and could adapt his views when necessary. He proved an adept leader of his party, partly because his reputation as a man of honour meant he could persuade them to adopt policies they found distasteful, but also because he showed great skill at sustaining morale in disheartening times. Having been invited to an audience with Victoria and Albert on 22nd February 1852, Derby at once agreed that he would try and form a government. He warned, however, that the difficult circumstances meant he would need firm royal support. And when the Queen tried to direct him on policy, he was understandably irritated, asking him to remember that since her accession, she had identified herself with a liberal policy in conformity with the wishes of the bulk of her people. Victoria told him she was fearful it might be thought she had changed her opinion with the change of her ministers. She therefore hoped he would not propose measures in direct opposition to a liberal policy, by which she meant a return to protection. Becoming somewhat heated, Derby said he thought there existed different opinions as to what the real wishes of the people were. While he would not bring in measures that lacked public support, he could not be expected to retain all of Peel's free trade policies. As in 1851, Derby suffered from a shortage of competent and experienced men to whom he could offer ministerial office. His attempts to entice men from other political groupings to join his ministry failed, so he had to fall back on members of his own party. And as Jeff was saying, the resulting cabinet was known as the Who Ministry, after the deaf Duke of Wellington, was overheard repeating this question in mystification as Lord Derby tried to tell him the names of obscure individuals who had accepted office. When Derby notified Prince Albert that he was going to appoint Lord Malmesbury Foreign Secretary, Albert was so alarmed that he placed an exclamation mark besides Malmesbury's name in the margin of Derby's letter. The Queen shared these reservations, telling her uncle, King Leopold of the Belgians, "I cannot say Malmesbury inspires me with confidence." The greatest sensation of all was caused by the appointment of Benjamin Disraeli as Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the Commons. Disraeli himself feared that he scarcely possessed the requisite economic expertise, but Derby shrugged this off. "They give you the figures," he said airily. Others were less sanguine. One MP considered it degrading to an Englishman that a man formerly connected with half the disreputable bill transactions in London was now steward of the national finances. The Queen, too, hardly welcomed the appointment, although as the weeks went by, she did find herself rather intrigued by Disraeli, enjoying the notes he sent her containing colourful accounts of Commons debates in what she called very flowery language. Albert, in contrast, remained profoundly suspicious of Disraeli, and once warned Derby that he believed Disraeli's democratic tendencies made him potentially one of the most dangerous men in Europe. To the Queen, Derby was apologetic about his undistinguished cabinet, saying he would have liked to have appointed men of better calibre, rather than persons of whom the best that could be said was that she did not object to them. Victoria was indeed decidedly unimpressed by her new servants. She noted on 23rd February, "I had hoped to the last that Lord Derby would not succeed, and though she drew some consolation from the reflection that such a sorry cabinet cannot last long, she could not be otherwise than ashamed and humiliated at the current state of affairs." She and Albert were also disapproving of some of the names put forward by Derby to serve in the royal household. Noting that Derby's circle included roués and men of extreme fashion and lack of morals, the Queen recorded, "Dear Albert has had to resist one or two people who were named." Once the government was in place, the Queen wrote to her uncle, King Leopold, "I shall take the trial as patiently as I can, but it is one, for we can have no sympathies with the present people." At first, she and Albert scarcely hid their antipathy. Derby's son said the Prime Minister's initial dealings with the royal couple were difficult. He found the Queen reserved, the Prince manifestly unfriendly. They made it clear that they thought it their right to monitor the government's activities, demanding to be briefed about everything that is going on. Derby's son recorded, "The Prince is constantly in the habit of expressing to Lord Derby and his colleagues what he states to be the Queen's wishes on this and that point, and doing so in a cold and even dictatorial manner." Gradually, things thawed as the King came to have a better appreciation of Derby's considerable abilities. Having been agreeably surprised when Derby and Malmesbury dined at Buckingham Palace on 3rd March, she was very well satisfied by a meeting with the Premier that took place 2 days later. "He's very able and certainly quite the Prime Minister," she decided. A fortnight later, she acknowledged that Derby was proving a most talented, capable and courageous Prime Minister, who was always excessively fluent and clear. By June, Derby was better received at every visit. The Queen and Prince were still far from being unqualified admirers and hesitated about asking Lord Derby to stay at Windsor for Ascot, from a fear that the court would become unpopular if associated with him. But in the end, the invitation was issued. Throughout the summer, Albert went on relaying the Queen's wishes to the ministers, but by August, these communications were no longer delivered in such a peremptory manner, having become friendly and confidential. One reason for this was that by that time, protection was a much less divisive issue. Derby had only avoided having the opposition combine against him by agreeing to dissolve Parliament as soon as essential measures had been passed. After an election had taken place, it was agreed a new Parliament would convene in the autumn, and it was understood that Disraeli would then produce a detailed budget. Derby explained to the Queen that he could not with honour or credit abandon protection until the country had pronounced against it in an election. But once that had happened, the question could be regarded as entirely disposed of. By late March, he was predicting that though the election would give him a working majority, it would not be a conclusive enough victory to justify the reintroduction of protection. Victoria exulted to her uncle, King Leopold, that Derby acknowledged that the prospects for protection were quite gone. It is a pity they did not find this out a little sooner. It would have saved so much annoyance. The general election that took place in July 1852 was disappointing for the Conservatives, as the protectionists were once again increasingly styling themselves, going not more than tolerably well for the ministry. It did not deliver the overall majority that Derby had expected, let alone a mandate to reintroduce a duty on corn. The government was clearly unlikely to last long unless it strengthened itself by securing the support of outsiders. But once again, Derby failed to bring fresh blood into the government. This made it inevitable that the government would struggle to secure a majority for Disraeli's budget, to be presented to the Commons in early December. The problem was compounded by the fact that Victoria and Albert were demanding large increases in defence spending. The Queen wrote repeatedly to Derby, insisting that the country's defenceless state necessitated a large outlay. And though she grumbled to her uncle that the Prime Minister was never alarmed enough about the issue, he did agree that funds must be found to pay for additional seamen and soldiers. Derby told Disraeli, who resented the way those damned defences were upsetting his financial plans, "Put a good face upon it and we shall pull through." But in fact, after several nights of impassioned debate on the budget, the government was defeated on 17th December 1852 by a majority of 19 votes. Derby at once exclaimed, "Now we are properly smashed." When Derby arrived at Osborne to present his resignation that evening, he appeared very sore at his fall. Victoria was less upset about events. While the diarist Charles Greville was perhaps rather harsh to claim she was delighted to have got rid of Derby and his crew, she certainly did not mourn their passing overmuch. In her journal, she pronounced the government's demise inevitable, as the country can have no confidence in men like Mr. Disraeli. The Queen didn't feel that much more warmly towards Derby when he came Prime Minister for the second time in February 1858. She had been much vexed and thunderstruck when the Tories had unexpectedly defeated Lord Palmerston's government after it had sought to introduce anti-terrorism legislation that had Victoria's approval, but which MPs from all sides of the House disliked. The Queen felt that those who had successfully voted against the measure had displayed a total want of patriotism, but she accepted Palmerston's resignation and invited Derby to form a government in his place. It was clear that Derby would not have an easy time because the Conservatives were heavily outnumbered in the Commons. But Victoria and Albert felt he must take the consequences of levity for having opportunistically voted out the ministry. Derby managed to assemble a tolerably presentable cabinet, but nobody expected that his second term as Prime Minister would last long. Victoria was not disposed to help Derby when it looked like he might lose a vote of censure that the opposition were planning to move against his government. Derby asked her permission to give out that she would authorise a dissolution of Parliament were the government to be defeated in the Commons. But Victoria objected that attempting to bias the opinion of MPs in this way would be a very unconstitutional threat to hold over the head of Parliament. Derby appeared very much disappointed and mortified by her unaccommodating stance. But after taking further advice, she did soften sufficiently to agree that Derby could unofficially let it be known that a dissolution would take place, even if her name must not explicitly be made use of. As a result, the opposition dropped the vote of censure, and Derby's government survived to get the India Bill that removed the East India Company's jurisdiction over the subcontinent through Parliament. Quite an achievement in the circumstances. However, in March 1859, Derby's government was defeated in the Commons after attempting to bring in a modest measure of political reform. This time, the Queen made no difficulties about authorising a dissolution, but contrary to Derby's hopes, the Conservatives once again failed to secure an overall majority at the ensuing general election. The Queen, who now felt much better disposed to Derby, was nevertheless optimistic that his government could retain office. But, in fact, on 11th June, the Liberal opposition coalesced to pass an amendment to the Queen's speech that meant that Derby once again had to resign. Victoria, who had hoped that the government may weather this storm, was very upset by what she balefully called wicked people having brought them down. But her distress at losing Derby in this way perhaps owed less to her having a genuinely positive attitude towards him than a dread that Palmerston's incoming ministry would be much more sympathetic towards the cause of Italian independence than Derby's Conservatives. This was very much the hottest topic of the time, for war was currently raging in Europe as the Italians, aided by the French, were seeking to throw out their Austrian rulers. Being very pro-Austrian and anti-French, Victoria was confident she could count on Derby not to offer Italians British support, whereas Palmerston might wish to involve Britain on the Italian side. But political realities meant she could not avoid this unpalatable change of ministry. Derby's third and final term as Prime Minister in the years 1866 to 68 was in many ways his most successful, despite the fact that once again he did not have a Commons majority. Victoria had invited him to form a government in June 1866 after Earl Russell resigned because his reform bill had failed to pass the Commons. The Queen suggested to Derby that he include some Liberals in his new government, but though Derby tried to comply with her wishes, no Liberals were willing to serve under him. As a result, Derby found himself once again at the head of a minority but exclusively Conservative government, something which he had sworn never again to inflict on himself. His problems were compounded by the fact that he decided that he must address the controversial question of political reform, the very issue on which Earl Russell's government had foundered. Whereas hitherto it had been supposed the British public were apathetic towards reform, by the late summer of 1866, it became apparent that there was widespread and strong feeling in favour of franchise expansion. Mass meetings were held all over the country, clamouring for it, and there were fears that if nothing was done to gratify demands for reform, there would be a breakdown of public order. Consequently, although Derby did not underestimate the difficulties involved, he decided, as he told his leader of the Commons, Disraeli, "We cannot escape doing something." By this time, the Queen, too, felt that tackling reform had become a positive necessity. When Derby went to stay at Balmoral in late September, Victoria told him bluntly that if reform be not taken up in earnest by her ministers, very serious consequences may ensue. The Prime Minister informed Disraeli that she was not only very anxious to see it settled, but, furthermore, settled by us. The Queen even offered to try and ease things by acting as an intermediary between government and opposition, hoping that she could bring about a spirit of mutual conciliation between the rival parties. Derby did not want to take up a suggestion that he felt would merely expose to his opponents his political weakness and would therefore, as he explained to Victoria, be more prejudicial than advantageous to the government. Far from being offended, the Queen indicated that she approved of Derby's approach. To Disraeli, Derby exulted that, as regards the court, we are on velvet. But it soon emerged that pursuing political reform entailed dreadful challenges. One problem was that several members of Derby's cabinet were not in favour of it. In particular, the Secretary of State for War, General Jonathan Peel, was strongly against introducing any kind of reform bill. And in February 1867, it appeared that he would bring about a breakup of the government by resigning. Victoria at once exerted herself to help Derby out, prevailing on General Peel to remain in the government by writing what Disraeli described as a magical letter to him, appealing to Peel's patriotism and chivalrous regard for the Queen's personal comfort and well-being. But this miracle turned out to be only a temporary reprieve, because when Derby and Disraeli's bill was outlined to the Cabinet, not just Peel, but Lords Cranborne and Carnarvon all declared that they thought the measure was too extensive and they would resign unless it was modified. In a desperate bid to retain the three men, Derby and Disraeli hastily revised the bill's provisions, but it soon became apparent that in its new form, it was most unlikely to be voted through the House of Commons. Consequently, Derby's government looked doomed. Once again, the Queen came to Derby's rescue. On 26 February 1867, the Prime Minister came to her in terribly low spirits, whereupon she gave him a bracing talk, urging him to accept the departure of the three dissenting cabinet members and reproduce the original measure. This was duly done. On 18th March, Disraeli presented the original bill to Parliament, and over the next 4 months, he was in charge of its passage through the Commons. This was an immensely complicated task, and he secured the necessary votes by frequently accepting amendments that drastically changed the bill's complexion. Derby had to leave things in Disraeli's hands, not just because, as a peer, he could not directly participate in Commons debates, but also because he was suffering so badly from gout that he had to leave London for 3 weeks in April 1867. The result was that the bill that received the royal assent on 15th August was much more far-reaching than had originally been envisaged. This was not altogether welcome to the Queen, who had always been somewhat apprehensive that the bill would be too radical, but had been reassured by Disraeli's promises that it contained no spice of democracy. While the measure was in the later stages of debate in the Commons, she had written to Derby, saying she was watching its progress with deepest interest and not a little anxiety. She noted that decisions had been made in the Commons so suddenly and so unexpectedly that she hardly knew what to make of them. In view of the fact that the bill had been transformed in a way that even the most advanced Liberals regard with some degree of alarm, she hoped that when the bill was sent to the upper house for consideration, Derby would accept amendments from the Lords designed to avert the danger which many people apprehend from the great increase in democratic power. In reply, Derby had frankly confessed his belief that some changes to the original proposals had been accepted without sufficient discussion, and he added that there were one or two provisions which Lord Derby would rather have seen omitted. Nevertheless, when the bill was debated in the Lords, Derby saw to it that the measure entered the statute book virtually unaltered. The Queen accepted this, even as she was somewhat unnerved by what she called Derby's rather extraordinary admission to his fellow peers that the Reform Bill represented something of a leap in the dark. Throughout the second Reform Bill crisis, Victoria could hardly have been more supportive to Lord Derby. When it came to other matters, however, she often made his life harder. Although by 1867 it was more than 5 years since Prince Albert had died, the Queen was still in deep mourning, maintaining that her grief was still so intense that it was impossible for her to perform ceremonial duties or appear in public. Her continued seclusion was now attracting a good deal of unfavourable comment, and the monarchy's popularity was in decline. Furthermore, the fact that Victoria habitually shut herself away at Osborne and Balmoral with her Highland servant, John Brown, in constant attendance, was also giving rise to scandal and ribald jokes about the nature of the relationship, and it fell to Derby to deal with this situation. In February 1867, it had looked as though things might improve because the Queen agreed to open Parliament, despite the fact that she regarded this as a great, trying and painful ordeal. Unfortunately, as she drove to Westminster in her coach, high unemployment and what Victoria called that stupid reform agitation meant that she was given a poor reception. There was a good deal of hissing and even groaning from a crowd that contained many nasty faces. The Queen chided Derby for having subjected her to the sort of experience which I, in my present forlorn condition, ought not to be exposed to. A few months later, Derby had congratulated himself when Victoria had agreed to attend a military review in Hyde Park that was scheduled for July 1867. But then worrying reports reached him to the effect that if John Brown accompanied her and was visible on the box of her carriage, agitators might cause scenes of an unpleasant nature by barracking him aggressively. Though fully aware of the sensitivity of raising this matter with the Queen, it seems that after having a long talk on the troublesome John Brown with the Home Secretary, Derby did make some kind of remonstrance to her. She agreed that Brown should not be present at the review, but then regretted having been weak enough to let Lord D understand that she recognised there had been cause for alarm. Resentful at all the worry and uneasy sensations she had experienced as a result, she noted that the episode left a painful, bitter feeling in her heart. And in the end, it turned out that Derby's intervention had been pointless because the Hyde Park review had to be cancelled for other reasons. By this time, Victoria's private secretary, General Charles Grey, had become convinced that for the sake of our monarchical institution, the Queen must be coerced into fulfilling her responsibilities. Writing to Derby that we are come to a crisis as regards the Queen, he insisted it was the Prime Minister's duty to speak plainly to her. While he did not deny that she may be very angry about being confronted in this way, he was adamant that Derby must not shrink from doing what was necessary. Derby did his best. For some time, he had been pressing Victoria to offer generous hospitality to the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Aziz, when the latter visited England. Now the Prime Minister wrote to Victoria, imploring her to postpone her departure to Balmoral so that she could either welcome the Sultan at Buckingham Palace on the day he arrived in London, or, failing that, at least give him lunch at Windsor Castle the following afternoon. Derby explained that he and his colleagues felt so strongly about the matter that he could submit a cabinet minute on the subject, but he hoped his private appeal would suffice. In a letter marked secret, General Grey reported to Derby that when Victoria read what the Prime Minister had written, she flew into a towering passion and flatly refused to receive the Sultan in London. She did at least grudgingly agree to lay on a lunch for him at Windsor, though it is very annoying to her, but underlined how much of a sacrifice this entailed by sending her personal physician to update Derby on the supposedly perilous state of her health. She warned Derby that she believed herself on the verge of a complete breakdown, and Dr. Jenner confirmed to the Prime Minister that agitation of any kind induced in her violent fits of bilious sickness. Trying valiantly not to sound sarcastic, Derby wrote to the Queen that while it was evident the utmost care must be taken of her, it was difficult for those with no access to privileged information to distinguish between the physical strength which enables your Majesty to take long journeys without fatigue and nervous problems caused by trifling excitement. He added that, of course, this distinction shall be sedulously borne in mind by himself. On 6th July, the Cabinet very seriously discussed the Queen's mental and physical state. They agreed that, in view of what they had learned, they could not apply further pressure on her to carry out her responsibilities or perform tasks she claimed to be beyond her. If they acted otherwise, they believed there was a real risk that Victoria might go completely insane. The Queen was eager for Lord Derby to know that she was in no condition to perform the duties expected of her. But in reality, of course, it was Derby who was in infinitely worse shape than her. By early 1868, it was apparent that he would soon have to retire on health grounds. Victoria was not particularly dismayed about this, as she was now so entranced by Disraeli that she relished the prospect of his succeeding Derby as Prime Minister. However, on 21st February, Lord Derby threw all into confusion by informing the Queen that he did not want to relinquish office until he was able to surrender the seals in person. The resultant delay would have caused practical difficulties, and Victoria wrote back saying that while she was deeply grieved by the thought of his departure, what he proposed was hardly feasible. Unfortunately, she expressed herself badly, and Derby's son, Lord Stanley, claimed her curt letter had left his father very sore. Stanley reported in his diary, "She seems to have told him he had better resign at once in order to save her trouble." Very much not a fan of the Queen, Stanley commented he was not surprised by this development, as he believed Victoria saw no reason for wasting civility on those who can no longer be of use to her. It looks like Victoria realised she had handled the matter clumsily. For a few weeks after Derby's retirement, she did her best to make amends. On 3rd April 1868, Derby reported to Disraeli from his London house in St James's Square that the Queen honoured me this morning with a visit of near an hour, which was a very rare distinction that she bestowed on few of her prime ministers. In a letter she wrote to Derby only 4 months before his death in October 1869, she emphasised that she well knew how loyal and how devoted to her person and throne Lord Derby is, making plain that she greatly appreciated the service he had rendered her. So, although Derby's career as Prime Minister had ended on a rather infelicitous note, one must hope that ultimately all was put right. After the inauspicious beginning to his first premiership, Derby had managed to establish himself in the Queen's eyes as a wise elder statesman who personified the conservative values that by the end of her reign she so strongly favoured.